Hello everyone, my name is Ruslan, but some of you might know me as Astrophotography on social media. Now, I've been doing astrophotography since 2012, so almost 8 years from now. And many of you people have been actually asking me if I could do a video tutorial on how I edit my images. So in this video tutorial I will demonstrate you the technique that I'm using to blend my Nightscape photographs, where I use the sky tracker to track the sky and untracked foreground to create a master panorama. Now, since we're not going to work with a single image as you probably might do if you're a beginner in astrophotography, I'm going to work with the layer masks in Photoshop to manually blend and align the layers to create a master panorama image. So in this case I will be using both Photoshop and Lightroom. With the technique that I will show you in this tutorial, you will be able to create your own natural-looking nightscape images if you would also like to use a sky tracker to track the sky with much longer exposure and separately expose the foreground to achieve much more details in the shadows. So I hope this video tutorial will help you for your future works, and yeah, let's get right into it. Alright guys, so here we are in Lightroom. And today we will be working with these 5 frames from which we will create this master panorama image. Here I have 3 images where I track the sky with my Ioptron Sky Tracker V2, and the other 2 frames of the foreground will be used for the focus stacking. So if we go to the development tab, you might notice that the picture looks too pink. And that's because I'm using an astro-modified camera to capture more infrared light, or so-called deep hydrogen alpha red color. Usually the images that you capture with a regular camera sensor will look something like this. But no matter what, if you are shooting RAW and you are using a RAW converter to edit the photos, you can always change white balance just with one click without affecting the quality of the image. Anyway, this photograph was taken with my Canon EOS 6D camera and a Samyang 24mm f1.4 lens. So here we have a full-frame sensor and a wide-angle lens, meaning that it's a big field of view which was captured. Personally, this is my most favorite combination. The foreground frame with me as the main subject in this image was shot with a 30 seconds exposure. I also set my aperture half a stop down to f2, and the ISO was set to 3200, which is actually not a big deal for the Canon 6D, even though the camera is more than 5 years old. You need to capture enough light to compensate for the high level of your ISO, which can be done with longer exposure time. So as you can see, in my case, I don't really have any color banding in the dark corners of the image. Usually I always start with the adjustment of the white balance. It can be done manually with the help of these sliders, but I find it a little bit time consuming. Instead, you can grab the white balance selection tool by pressing this icon or by pressing W letter on your keyboard. Now we need to pick a neutral color to set the white balance. And the neutral colors are black, gray and white. I'm going to pick a color in this area because the night sky should always look neutral. Neither too blue or too yellow. Right, after we have set the correct white balance, we can increase the shadow slider to make dark parts of the image brighter. So I'm going to set the slider to around 70, and you can already see that the image got much brighter, especially if you look at the levels. The next thing we should do is to add some contrast with the help of whites and blacks sliders. Usually I set whites pretty high up, but the black slider I almost never touch when it comes to the foreground images. For example, if you will set blacks in minus, you will lose quite a lot of details in the shadows. And if you will set the slider pretty high up, you will get this sort of a vintage look, especially in the corners of the image. But in this particular case, I think I will add some blacks. Something around plus 20. Now, since I live in a low light polluted area, the light pollution doesn't really affect my photos. Here you can see those some bright spots along the horizon. Usually you want to set the highlight slider down, but because my foreground gets darker, I'm not going to change it. Though if the light pollution affects your foreground too much, then you should go down in the highlights to something around -57 or maybe even lower. When it comes to adding the clarity, I'm actually really skeptical about using this slider. If you will add too much of it, you'll get a lot of contrast and lose softness of the image, which is something you should avoid when it comes to astro and nightscape photographs, where you want to achieve a natural look. So either I leave the clarity at 0 or set it as high as +10. And that was pretty much it with our basic adjustments. The next step is to use the turn curve to adjust contrast of different parts of the image, almost the same as the highlights, shadows, whites, and black sliders. Usually I set the first point by clicking the curve around the shadows area, and then I pick the second area around the midtones. Click on it and drag it up so the image gets a little bit brighter. As you might have noticed, now we have brought more highlights by affecting the curve, so it might be a good idea to go back and forth in the editing process to fine-tune every detail of the image. If you want to play around with the colors, set the mood of the picture, you can do it down here in the color adjustment, but this is optional. For example, in my works, I like to set yellow and orange color towards the reddish tone. So both of these sliders I set to the left side from the midpoint, and along that I add a little bit of saturation. So if we go back to the point before any color adjustments, you can see that both the grass and my coat had this greenish tone. Oh yeah, and the light pollution in this side of the image too. But now, after the adjustments, the color became much warmer and we got almost rid of the green tone. You should be aware though, if your light pollution has a strong yellow cast, in my case I have mostly white colored LED lights, so you should pay attention on how much you change the color hue. Sometimes you might even want to go down in the saturation of the yellow and orange color sliders to reduce the colorful glow which comes due to the light pollution. But here I kinda like the result as it looks. Otherwise, I don't really touch any other sliders when it comes to editing my images in Lightroom. Next up, we have one of the most important things, which is sharpening the image and reducing the noise that will increase the image quality significantly. If we zoom in, then you will be able to see the grain, especially in the darkest parts of the image, which is something that comes along with the high ISO. ISO 3200 is pretty decent, by the way, but it is already enough to add some noise to the image. Now, when it comes to sharpening, I set it to 100, the radius I set to 0.5, the detail slider I set to 50, and masking I don't touch. To remove noise, I set luminance to 50, detail goes to 75, and contrast I set to 50 as well. Now, I'm not going to remove color noise because it might affect our future result as an astrophotograph. You can lose a lot of color details, especially of the nebulosity or if you shoot deep sky, if you will set the slider pretty high up. To demonstrate the difference between before and after the noise reduction, I will just zoom out. On a big screen I can clearly see the difference. Hope you are able to see it on YouTube as well. Here in the left side of the image it was really grainy, but after the recent adjustments it looks softer. But not too much to be able to affect the details. So yeah, right about that. And the last important thing we need to do is to remove the vignetting. A lens vignetting is something that comes along with almost any lenses, especially wide-angle ones. It can be extremely noticeable when you are shooting with fully open aperture. For instance, my Samyang 24mm is performing pretty bad at f1.4, as some people might say. And this is why I always set my aperture half a stop down to f2. So the image corners become less dark, plus you add a bit of extra sharpness to the field of view. So to remove lens vignetting, you just move the amount slider to the right side Here I will set it to plus 36, but in your case it will be depending on the lens you are using. If we just look at the preview in the top left corner, you can already clearly notice how the image flattens out, especially in the sides and in the corners. And here once again, I will just demonstrate the effect before and after the lens vignetting. The other thing which also depends on your lens quality are the chromatic aberrations. Usually those look like rainbow halos around the stars. If you have a good or an expensive lens, then you don't really need to activate this slider. So even though my lens is one of the cheapest ones of the 24mm, I don't really touch the aberration slider because I set my aperture down to f2. Also, if you want, you can activate the lens correction to fix the distortion and so on, but because I do everything manually in Photoshop, I almost never touch anything except the lens vignetting slider when it comes to editing in Lightroom. So we have finished editing the first image, which we're going to use as the base frame for creating our big panorama. The second image that I have talked earlier about is the photo of the same foreground, but where I focused on the stars to get the horizon sharper. You can see though that the stars turned into the star trails since my exposure time was too long for the 24mm. But that's alright because we won't be using the sky from this shot. In the first image with me in the foreground, the horizon is out of the focus, so this is why we need this second frame to do the focus stacking. Because we have already edited our base exposure of the foreground, we can simply copy these settings by clicking the previous button to get all our settings and adjustments synchronized. So this was the image number 1, and this is the image number 2. I can see that my camera captured a reflection of a plane trail, but because we will be using the other shot as our base exposure, there is no actual need to remove the light trail with the help of the clone stamp tool or a spot removal tool. Now, moving on to the sky frames. Basically, we can copy all the settings from the foreground frames, but now you can clearly see the difference in the brightness. Because the exposure time was 73 seconds, even though the ISO was lowered down to 1600, the image is still much brighter compared to the first two ones. Since here we are not dealing with any dark parts of the image, we can go back to the basic settings of the post-processing and set the shadow slider back to 0. The black slider, which we earlier have set to plus 21, can be switched to the opposite side of the midpoint, because now we can add contrast to the sky. You might notice that the foreground got darker, but since we are working with the sky exposure, we should not be bothered by anything that is below the horizon line. Now we can switch the color temperature as well, because the sky looks too blue for me. And this is too yellow. I think I will just pick an area where the sky should be more or less natural. So yeah, somewhere around that. You can see up here in the image data that we have a lot of whites and highlights, which means that our image is almost overexposed. I'm going to reduce the exposure, but once again, remember that the photo should not be too dark or too bright. So around minus 0.64 gives a pretty good look in this case. But we can still do some fine adjustments such as brightening up the whites and reducing the highlights. Especially now when we are dealing with the longer exposure of the sky, the light pollution gets even more noticeable. We can even go back to the curve and make it look more like an S shape, where we are bringing some midtones up. And actually, I feel like switching the color temperature one more time. Yeah, that looks nice. I still think there is too much vignetting, so I'm going to reduce it once again by dragging these sliders. That's about right. It still feels though that the image is too bright, so I'll reduce the exposure just a little bit more. And after we have finished editing this frame, we can finally synchronize the settings with the remaining 2 frames and do some small adjustments. Alright, now we have almost finished with the Lightroom. There are many different ways how to open the files in Photoshop and make a panorama, but I prefer to export each image as a TIFF file, even though the file size is usually way above 100 megabytes. With the help of TIFF, you won't lose the image quality if you want to work further with it in Photoshop and do the adjustments. So I will select all the images, then click on File and Export. Here make sure that you are saving as TIFF. The color space is set to Adobe RGB and the bit depth is 16-bit. After Lightroom has finished exporting the files, you should be able to find the images in your export folder and open the Photoshop. To make the master panorama, we should create a focus stacked foreground from the first 2 frames, and later on stack the sky as a vertical panorama. Since there is no correct order in this case, I will first stack our sky frames. This can be easily done in the way as you would usually do the panorama stitching. So here I'm clicking on File, Automate, and then Photo Merge. In the menu I choose Browse and select our 3 images of this tracked sky from the folder and hit OK. Alright, so far so good. If we zoom in and look around the image, we can actually see that Photoshop has done a pretty good job in stitching the images as a panorama. But we still need to get rid of the plane and satellite trails later in the process. So now I will merge all the layers by pressing the Ctrl or Command if you're on a Mac, Shift and E. So we have the layers merged together. We should definitely fix the horizon since it's a little bit tilted to the side, and crop the image so we don't get any empty space. To remove the unwanted plane and satellite trails, always start with making a copy of the layer by pressing Ctrl and J. And now I'm simply going to use a clone stamp tool to remove all the artifacts which I don't want to be in my image. I will speed up the process so you can see the final result. When you have finished the process, we can once again merge all the layers together and save the result as a TIFF file. And now we can back to the 2 foreground shots by opening them in Photoshop as separate files. I will drag this photo over to our base exposure and I'm holding Shift down to place the image in the center of the frame. To align these 2 shots even better, I'm going to select both layers and then I am clicking on Edit, Auto Align Layers, and by going with the automatic settings, I will just click OK. Alright, as you can see we have both layers perfectly aligned, where the horizon line is matching. I will click on the upper layer and create a layer mask. Now I am selecting a brush tool by pressing B on my keyboard. I have black as my foreground color and the opacity is set to 100%. Simply paint with the brush tool on the areas below the horizon which you want to hide to manually create the focus stacked result. So that's about it. If we take a look at the layer mask, you can see that we have removed everything but the horizon and the sky. And here is the before and after. By taking a closer look, especially at the tree line and the sky line, now we can see that we got everything in focus. So I will just merge the layers and crop the image to fit the frame. Alright, we have created 2 images, a foreground frame and a sky frame. So the next step will be merging these 2 layers to create our final tracked and blended panorama. I will press W on my keyboard to activate the quick selection tool and select the entire foreground together with the horizon, but not the sky. If you have more or bigger trees in your photos, the selection might be a little bit tricky. As you can see here, my selection is pretty inaccurate, but since in my case the trees are far away, it's not going to affect the outcome result. To create a layer of our foreground, I'm going to press Ctrl C to copy and Ctrl V to paste. And here you can see that our foreground has been separated from the image. Click on the layer 1, then go back to the panorama of the sky and drag it over to the focus stacked foreground image. Remember to hold Shift key down before you release the mouse to place the sky in the middle of the frame. Use Free Transform tool by pressing Ctrl T to align position of the sky to match the horizon and crop the image. So we have finally created our master panorama, which consists of tracked sky and untracked foreground. To make even a better transition between the earth and the sky, and to make a natural looking blend, it might be a good idea to work with a layer mask. Just create a layer mask on the sky layer and paint with the black brush along the horizon line to achieve a smoother transition. Usually when you're shooting the foreground with a longer exposure, you might still capture portions of the sky in your frame together with the star trails. But if you go back to the layer 1, you can use the clone stamp tool to get rid of all of the star trails. From here we can work with different layer masks, apply curves to add contrast to specific area of the image, reduce the stars and so on. So I always make a copy of the layer and use the quick selection tool to select the entire foreground once again. Now I'm going to create a layer mask and copy the layer. Instead of selecting the sky, you can click on the upper layer mask and invert it by pressing Ctrl and I on the keyboard. So as you can see, our sky layer mask looks like this, and in our middle layer only the foreground is activated. To make a smoother transition, you can set the feather a little bit higher up to avoid the sharp edges of the selection. From here, I usually start to work with my foreground by adding a new curves layer. I'm holding Alt key down before clicking in between these two layers to create a clipping mask, because I only want to make the adjustments on the layer which is below the curves. And the same I will apply for our sky layer. To demonstrate how it works, I will go back to the curves linked to the foreground layer. And here you can see that only the lower part of the image is being affected by the adjustments. So for instance, if I want to make my foreground brighter, I will make a sort of a S-curve, but remember that you should keep the sky and the foreground about the same brightness. So don't make only some parts brighter or darker. There should be a balance. And when it comes to the sky, I still feel that it can have a little bit more contrast. You can play around with different adjustment layers that fit your taste, but I will move to the last part of this tutorial, which is the star reduction technique. It's a really powerful technique, especially if you're shooting with a sky tracker. Here you can clearly see that there are simply too many stars, which in some way look almost like noise, because the camera sensor captures all the light that comes from the faint stars that you are not able to see with the naked eye. To reduce the stars, you want to zoom in so you can see all the stars in details. And remember to copy the layer, because if something will go wrong, you can easily go back to the process and make a change. So I will click Select in the menu up here and then Color Range. In the window, sample colors might be selected, the range should be at 100%, and your fuzziness should be set to a high enough level to detect the stars. But again, your selection will be depending on your image size and the focal length of the lens, which you use to photograph the night sky. And now I will click in the middle of one of the brighter stars, so you can see the selection here in the preview. And if I click OK, you will see that we have selected all the stars in our image. You can also fine adjust the selection by going to Select, Modify, and Feather to make the selected area round. The feather ratio should be somewhere around 1 or 2 pixels, so I will just go with 2. And you can also expand the selection by either 1 or 2 pixels, but once again, this is optional and it depends on the focal length. After we have selected all the stars and done the fine adjustments, we can finally reduce the stars. And to do that, you go to Filter, Other, and Minimum. The radius should not be higher than 2 pixels, because if you will set more than 2, the stars will turn into black dots, which is something we don't want to have in a picture. So I'm going to hit OK with the radius of 1 pixel, and remember to press Ctrl D to deselect the selection. Now if I zoom out, you can see the big difference the star reduction process has done. Maybe even too much, as now we got banding around the horizon, where parts of the light pollution were selected as well as the highlights. So sometimes you might want to get back and select the color range once again with the lower fuzziness, around 110 or so. Now I will just keep modifying the selection and go straight to Filter, Other, and Minimum, and hit OK. Since the selection has still affected a lot of highlights, you want to lower the opacity of the layer and sometimes even create a layer mask to remove the unwanted effect by painting with a black brush on the image. And here is the before and after we did the star reduction process. You can clearly notice the difference the technique has done. A lot of red nebulosity and the winter Milky Way gets much more visible. You can copy the layer and run the process once again to remove the stars from the areas where there are a lot of them, like here in the corners. So select color range, OK, and then Filter, Other, Minimum, and use a layer mask to mask out the areas where you don't want to apply the star reduction. After we have merged all the layers where the foreground is nice and clear, the horizon is in focus and our tracked sky has been applied, we have finally created a master panorama image. The star reduction technique is a really powerful tool to use to make the nebulosity pop. For instance, the Rosetta Nebula and the Barnard's Loop around the Orion are now extremely visible without applying any additional adjustments, even if we zoom out. From here you can continue your image processing by repeating some steps, such as adding curves to add more contrast to the sky, make the foreground brighter, or if you simply want to play around with the color. But yeah guys, that was basically the technique I'm using for creating almost all of my astrophotographs. If you will be trying it out, feel free to tag me on Instagram so I can see if this tutorial was helpful or not. Otherwise, let me know in the comments what do you think. If you want to see my astro works, make sure to follow me on Instagram. But yeah, that was basically about it for this time. Clear skies.